You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. Welcome back. In today's episode, we're diving back into the Private Pilot Airman Certification Standards, and this time we're talking about weather, which is in Area of Operation 1, Task C. Now, since the last episode, there has been a major change in the ACS, and that is a new version was released in May 31st of 2024 is when it went active. So because of that, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. We're going to talk about tasks A and B and the changes that have occurred. Rather than me doing two new episodes for those two tasks, not enough has changed to do a new episode, but I am going to cover the changes that happened with the new ACS. So if you listen to the old episodes, this will kind of update those and still keep them relevant under the new ACS. That'll only take a few minutes, and then we'll get started on the weather topic for today's main topic. All right, so I'm going to be using kind of an old version of the ACE guide, which has highlighted changes here. So we're in Area of Operation 1, Task A, and all the stuff that's in red here on the screen, and I'll read it for those of y'all listening just to the podcast, but if you're following along on YouTube or Patreon, the red indicates this is a new item that the FAA has added, and the yellow indicates there's just been a wording change. And I'm not even going to discuss the wording changes because they're very minor. I'll discuss one, the proficiency versus currency. The old verbiage said failure to distinguish proficiency versus currency. So all that they did is remove failure to distinguish. They removed those three words. That's the new version. So very minor changes there. In the red, however, these are new references. So these are references that occurred up here. The FAA added two references to Task A, which is pilot qualifications. They added an advisory circular that discusses basic med, and they added a reference to the Airplane Flying Handbook, which is the FAA Handbook 8083-3. That's the formal title of the AFH. All right, that's all that they did for pre-flight or for pilot qualifications. Very minor changes there. Next, on the airworthiness requirements, they added a little bit more. They added, again, a new reference to the Airplane Flying Handbook, changed some verbiage on K1A for the knowledge topic, nothing big there. But they added a new knowledge topic of K1E, and that's owner and operator pilot and command responsibilities. So I'm going to jump over to the new 5.6 version of the ACE guide. And there in this task, I've actually added a new link to a handbook called PlaneSense. So this is a new handbook that I integrated into, I think I started in version 4.5 maybe. I put the PlaneSense manual in the ACE guide, so that comes with the download now. You can, of course, download this for free off the FAA's website. But the PlaneSense manual is essentially a handbook on how to own an airplane. So I linked this manual there because a lot of the, back to that question here, owner and operator pilot and command responsibilities. Man, that's a big topic. There's a lot of owner-operator PIC responsibilities. And that's specific to an owner-operator. So if you're a renter, for instance, if you're renting an airplane, which I'd say 90% of students are renters, then this knowledge topic doesn't really apply to you. But I can see why the FAA wants to ask that, because once you get your pilot certificate, you may go out and buy an airplane, and you don't get like a new airplane owner's check ride once you buy an airplane. So me as an examiner, I want to make sure you maybe know the basics of how to own an airplane just in case you go out and buy one next week. And then I'm the examiner that signed you off saying, hey, you're a competent and safe pilot. You know, that may include you knowing a little bit about something you've never done, like own an airplane. Now, I don't expect you to be an expert airplane owner, but for me, the reason I put the PlaneSense manual link in here is if you said, well, I don't really know how to own an airplane, but I do know about this handbook called the PlaneSense Handbook, which has all these great checklists that I can follow as a potential buyer or new owner, and that will help me be a safe owner-operator. Man, that would be a great answer to that question. So that's why I linked it in the document there. Next up, we have a new knowledge topic of special or standard and special airworthiness certificates and associated operational limitations. So there's a new link to this, I believe to the AIM, the FAR, and you can find information about this in the PlaneSense manual. So how to get a standard versus a special airworthiness certificate Big picture, a standard airworthiness certificate, that's the thing that you have in your airplane right now. A special airworthiness certificate would be issued, let's say if you're doing some sort of maintenance ferry operation and you've been issued a special airworthiness certificate for a one-time flight to a location. Maybe because you're flying an airplane that doesn't have a current annual. That would be an example of that. Or if you're flying an aircraft that has some sort of damage or something like that, where it's a maintenance ferry. Don't confuse that with just a normal ferry flight of like, hey, I bought an airplane at point A over here and I'm ferrying that airplane to point B. That's a colloquial term. Doesn't mean the same thing as a true ferry flight where you're operating on a ferry permit. So those were the only changes to those two tasks. Again, I said I'd keep that brief. Again, you can see that's not really valid or a valid reason to do 2 whole new episodes. So those are the only things associated there. Some other stuff that I'll show you, again, if you're watching on the video, you can see I've got this is the default format of the ACS now. Everything doesn't have its own page on the FAA version. It kind of bleeds over, so you can see airworthiness requirements. It kind of ends halfway through the knowledge topics. Then we have to go to the next page to find the rest of the knowledge topics, risk management and skill items. Weather extends across 2 pages as well. I really didn't like that. There was one version of the ACE guide that had this new format. I got tired of it and reformatted it. So let's get started on our next topic and you'll see this new ACE guide format. Hopefully you'll find it as helpful as I do. So starting with the private pilot, area of operation 1, pre-flight preparation, task C, which is weather information. This is my new format of what I think is maybe an easier to use format, easier to read than the FAA default format. What I essentially did is I edited the PDF and crammed everything on one page. It doesn't have the nice table format. I really love the table format of the old style from 2018. I hate that the FAA decided to get rid of the table. It was a lot of work for me to re-tableize everything, if that's a word. But put everything back into a table format was very time intensive, so I decided not to do that. It was much easier for me to edit it, kind of squeeze the text together. The text is so close that I decided to add those gray bars to make it easier to follow one topic to the next, to see that, hey, I'm on that topic. So you kind of get the feel of a table without having to add all the lines. So hopefully you find that helpful. But let's get started on this task here. So this is task C. It lists our references and objectives. The references on the ACE guide are all hyperlinked now, so you can just click on the reference and it'll take you directly to what handbook that's discussing. So I think that's a neat, good feature. The objective here is just for you as the applicant to demonstrate satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with weather information for flight under VFR. That's a really important point there. I don't expect you and the ACS doesn't expect you to have the level of weather theory that a instrument pilot has, because you just need to avoid the weather, right? I'm not asking you to fly into the weather. I expect you to avoid it. So I need you to be able to look at a surface analysis chart and tell me, hey, where do you think VFR would be located there? I need you to be able to look at a METAR and say, is that weather that this METAR discusses here, is that conducive to VFR flight? Is this TAF for these airports along your route of flight, are they conducive to VFR flight? What is VFR flight when it comes to avoiding clouds? That's the type of knowledge that we expect to have as examiners. You don't have to sit in front of us and give us this, diatribe of weather theory like you're some sort of meteorologist. Don't expect that level of knowledge. Now, if you're like some of my applicants and an actual meteorologist, I'm looking at you, Carmen, then yeah, I might expect you to have a little bit more knowledge there. But anyway, let's look at the knowledge topics here. The knowledge topics have expanded quite a bit. The new version of the ACS actually added about 8 knowledge topics, and they're all a subcategory of knowledge topic 2. So let's look at knowledge topic 1 first. Let's go in order here. So knowledge topic 1 is sources of weather data. Example, the National Weather Service and Flight Service for flight planning purposes. I didn't put links on here because they're pretty self-explanatory. That's the National Weather Service is what feeds 4Flight's weather briefing. So if you followed my other videos on how to conduct a 4Flight weather briefing, and I'll be doing an update to that here soon, but that 4Flight weather briefing is using the National Weather Service. So there's no link there. Flight service is 1-800-weatherbrief.com. So if you're going to 1-800-WXbrief.com, that's the flight service. It's pulling all of its data, again, from the National Weather Service as well. And then that's for flight planning purposes. So next up, we have Knowledge Topic 2. This is acceptable weather products and resources required for pre-flight planning, current and forecast weather for departure, en route, and arrival phases of flight, such as, and it goes into A, B, C, D, E, F, and G are the subcategories. They are, in order, airport observations such as METAR and special and pilot observations. B, surface analysis charts, ceiling and visibility charts. C, terminal aerodrome forecasts, TAFs. D, graphical forecast for aviation, GFA. E, wind and temperature aloft forecast. F, convective outlook. And G, in-flight aviation weather advisories, including Airman's meteorological information, AirMets, and SIGMETs, and convective SIGMETs. So those are the subcategories. Now, if you look up at the top of the page, it says, note that if K2 is selected, so that's the one that we just read off all the subcategories, if that one is selected, the evaluator must assess the applicant's knowledge of at least 3 sub-elements. So if me as the examiner, I select K2, or when you go and take your knowledge test, you miss a knowledge topic that is in the K2 criteria, then I have to evaluate K2, which means I have to ask you 3 questions. So remember, typically a knowledge topic, the examiner just has to select at least 1 knowledge topic. Well, in this case, if you select the 1 knowledge topic, that expands to, you have to evaluate 3 different questions there, right? So if you're following along there. There's also, this caveat is in there for K3 as well, which is what we're going to cover next. So on the weather criteria here, the examiner may have to ask 6 knowledge topic questions if they select K2 and K3. You're looking at 6 questions instead of just 1. And of course, that also depends on your knowledge test. If on your knowledge test you missed, 4 different questions, then and 2 of those are K2, K3, then that's 6 questions, and then 2 more, 8. You can have 8 questions that I have to ask for weather. Now that sounds a little daunting, but not really, because a lot of these questions are built upon one another, right? If you're talking about, if I ask a simple question of, I show you a METAR, and I say, hey, this METAR, how long is this valid for? Well, it's only valid for an hour, right? And it's a current observation. I said, well, that's not very useful for a cross country. So how would you know what the weather is going to be when we get to the airport we're going to? Well, I would do that by looking at a TAF. Okay, well, what's a TAF? And you tell me about it. So I've already asked about 2 different things there in the scenario, right, in our scenario-based questioning. And if I cover just a couple of, let's say low ceilings, or I also throw in an AirMet there, we can quickly get to these 6 questions pretty quickly. They happen pretty naturally in scenario-based questioning. So don't lose a lot of sleep on, man, I have to memorize everything that's on this page. I want you to have a working knowledge of it. Now, the subcategories for K2, they can all be found in the FAA Weather Handbook, Chapter 24, which is our observations chapter. So most of the stuff that we're covering is covered here in Chapter 24, Aviation Weather Handbook. There's also stuff covered in the PHAC. You can find links for that here. But I haven't gone like I have in Knowledge Topic 3, which we're going to get into, and its subcategories. I have a link for every single line. I haven't done that yet for the forecasts. I just decided to link to the Chapter 24, and you can find that information for yourself. It's really easy to scroll through Chapter 24 and find all the answers for those. And as far as finding an answer for a TAF, there's not a necessarily answer for a TAF. It's just knowing what a TAF is, where to find it, and then how to read one, right? I'm probably have you tap on an airport on ForeFlight, or I'll show you a TAF, pull up a TAF online, and just ask you, hey, what is this? This line of the TAF? What does that mean? I'm not going to try to go out and find a really complicated TAF and have you decipher everything, but I will have you look at a basic TAF and be able to tell me, what is this trying to tell me as a pilot. If you are super reliant on the easy button on the TAF of being able to tap on there and see the translated version of the TAF, put a little bit of time understanding how to read an untranslated TAF. I'm not saying you have to know every single code by heart, but do your best to know the basic information as far as the valid time, the expected ceiling and viz, that basic sort of stuff. And it's the same as the METAR. Both the METAR and TAF know how to read those in a basic, format. Their graphical forecast, the GFA, that's a relatively new product out by the National Weather Service that you can find on aviationweather.gov. Maybe ask some questions about that. Basically know how to find it, and that's one of the things that's included in ForeFlight too. You can find that on the ForeFlight observations, or the weather tab of ForeFlight. I need to do a whole nother episode on ForeFlight weather. I think I have a YouTube video on that. Anyway, that's that. And then our convective outlook, air mets, winds and temperatures aloft. Remember, this is all scenario-based formatting, so we're going to cover a lot of these because you would have shown up to the check ride with a flight plan for your route of flight. And for that route of flight, you needed to know the winds and temperatures aloft. So you probably have already done the winds and temperatures aloft, right? It's on your navigation log. So we can integrate that questioning into this and cover that topic. Okay, so on to K3. This is our meteorology applicable to departure en route alternate destination under VFR and VMC, including expected climate and hazardous conditions such as, and then it goes into a laundry list of just weather phenomenon. Starts at A, goes all the way to L. So A through L. Each one of these lines on the ACE guide has a link. So if you click on the green button, it takes you to atmospheric pressure and altimetry chapter of the Aviation Weather Handbook. It's that easy to study. So if you want to know what wind shear is, click on the green button. It takes you to the winds chapter, or the temperature and heat exchange, the heat and chapter temperature, the heat and temperature chapter 5 of the Aviation Weather Handbook. So each of these green buttons takes you to a different link in the Aviation Weather Handbook. And then in addition to that, we have information over here on the right, which has discussions that have come up, like a weather briefing, personal minimums, an AOPA weather course that's free. I think that's a good course for you to take. The weather chapter of the PHAC, and then, of course, to the main weather handbook, which is the new, again, relatively new FAA handbook that covers all things weather. So let's just go by line. I could maybe spend 2 hours on this, so we're not going to have just an incredibly long time on each one of these, but let's at least discuss them. So 3A is atmospheric composition and stability. Know what a stable atmosphere is. Know what an unstable atmosphere is. Know which one, like if you hear that as a private pilot, hey, we have an unstable atmosphere, what does that mean? Well, it probably means in the summertime that you might have relatively good flying conditions, but it might be bumpy and you might have some isolated thunderstorms. Because a stable atmosphere, it sounds nice, right? As a pilot, I want the airplane to be stable when I fly, right? So a stable atmosphere must be good. Well, actually, a stable atmosphere might exist with IMC conditions, because a stable atmosphere means the air is happy where it's at and it's not going anywhere. And if that air is full of moisture, then that could be low-lying fog. It could be really low vis. It could be showery precip. That's a stable atmosphere. An unstable atmosphere, the analogy I use is, imagine if you had ping pong balls scattered across the top of a trampoline, and then you put a tent pole in the middle of the trampoline to raise it up just a little bit. All those ping pong balls would fall away down the slope away from that tent pole. The trampoline would be clear then, but if those ping pong balls represent air molecules, they're unstable. They went away. They're clear. Now we have clear air, like a clear trampoline, because of that high pressure system that's moved the air away. So the air is unstable because it's not happy where it's at and it's going somewhere else. Now I've oversimplified that, right? If you're a meteorologist, don't be picking me apart saying that you're wrong. The basic gist of that is an unstable atmosphere might actually be a good place for you to fly, but it is going to be bumpier, right? A super stable atmosphere might be IMC conditions. There's always exceptions to these, but this is a good rule of thumb. All right, our wind. We have several different factors here. Wind shear, mountain wave, factors affecting wind. So I might bring up, okay, what if you see an AirMet Tango? An AirMet Tango includes low-level wind shear, right? Tango for turbulence. We can have high and low turbulence and low-level wind shear. So that might be K3B knowledge topic might actually be related to knowledge topic K2G, because there's the AirMet there that talks to us about wind. That would be a good thing to know about wind. You know, how's that forecast? Wind shear, how's that forecast? And then factors affecting wind. So if we have a frontal passage, well, that's probably going to affect our wind. If we have a low pressure versus a high pressure system, which way does the wind spin around each of those pressure systems? That's a great thing to know, right? That low pressure system approaches, I'm going to see a wind shift of about 90 degrees. So if I'm flying at an airport that doesn't have a 90-degree crossing runway and there's a system approaching, I might take off and say, oh, the winds are right down the pipe. They're a little strong, but right down the pipe. I'll probably have a good hour before that system gets here. And you take off and go for a flight. You come back, and now the winds are out of limits for your crosswind because that cyclonic force, that pressure's gotten closer, and you saw a 90-degree wind shift. So that's a good topic that you could bring up here. Temperature and heat exchange. So knowing that, okay, the heat exchange can affect a lot of things. It can affect turbulence. It can affect that fog, that coastal fog, that intercoastal fog. That's all about heat exchange with the surface of the ocean, heating at a different rate and holding temperature differently than the land. It could mean, you know, as I approach different changes of terrain, I'm going to have different updrafts there. All right, knowledge topic 3D, that's moisture and precipitation. This link takes you to chapter 14, which is all about precipitation in the Aviation Weather Handbook. You can read all about moisture and precip there. 3E is weather system formation, including air masses and fronts. This is one that I like to talk about because I like to pull up a surface analysis chart or a prog chart, and I like to see you as a private pilot be able to point at a prog chart and say, based on that prog chart, I think I have a good chance of flying VFR here, and I have a good chance of not being able to fly VFR over here. And that ability to kind of analyze big picture weather, I think that's a good skill to have as a pilot. So that's a question that I might ask there on being able to identify that big frontal system and a front. So definitely know the difference between a warm front, cold front, stationary front, occluded front, read about all of those, and at least be able to kind of have that working knowledge, speak intelligently on those. And then if you don't know, like if you run into a brain block right there during the check ride, know that, okay, I can read about that in chapter 11 of the Aviation Weather Handbook. Can I look that up real quick? And you can navigate there very quickly using the ACE guide. All right, next up we have clouds. There's a appendix in the Aviation Weather Handbook on clouds, so I just linked that there. Feel free to read about all the different kinds of clouds. Turbulence. Remember, AirMet Tango is warning us about turbulence, and we have 3 different kinds, subcategories of AirMet Tango. We have low-level wind shear, low turbulence, and high turbulence. Typically, in the training environment, you're going to be worried about low-level wind shear and low turbulence, because high turbulence is up above 18,000 feet. So know that that's an AirMet that warns us of turbulence, and that if we have a lot of turbulence reported, we want to look at the type of aircraft reporting it, right? If you see a 737 reporting moderate turbulence, that might be severe turbulence for you in a 172. Know that turbulence can be discussed in a PIREP. Next, we have thunderstorms and microbursts. This is one that I ask pretty much everybody about. If I see a thunderstorm out there, how close can I come to that thunderstorm? What's the distance I must avoid it by? That's actually in the Aeronautical Information Manual. It has a little blurb in there about suggesting that you avoid thunderstorms by 20 nautical miles. So throw out, have a number there of, hey, I'm going to avoid any thunderstorms by 20 nautical miles. Microbursts might be associated with thunderstorms, right? If you're flying into a near convective activity, let's say, and you have a thunderstorm with active precip, so there's active rain coming out of the bottom of this thunderstorm, but there's a cloud right next to it that doesn't have any rain. Well, there might be a lot of rain on top of that cloud fixing to come out, and it might come out via that microburst, that downdraft that you could get, that severe downdraft. That's one of the reasons why we want to avoid thunderstorms, is because of those microbursts. Icing and freezing level information. Where do we find it? I don't, I expect you to know, hey, I can't fly in icing, obviously, as a private pilot. But how do I look up icing information? Where do I find the freezing level chart? That's all in ForeFlight there, of course. You can find it on aviationweather.gov as well. Fog and mist, I might ask, if sometimes there's a local METAR that will pull up. Usually during a check ride, I'll try to find a METAR in the country that's showing me that pink dot indicates low IFR. And I'll tap on that because generally low IFR, I want you as a private pilot to be able to read a METAR and say, yeah, that's definitely below my minimums as a VFR pilot. And one of the codes on there might be for fog or mist. So I expect you to be able to see that. There's also a link here that takes you to the Chapter 18 of the Aviation Weather Handbook that has fog and low ceiling mountain obscuration. That fog and mist also could relate back to an advisory circular of, or not an advisory circular, I'm sorry, a AirMet of AirMet Sierra. So AirMet Sierra, if I see that as a VFR pilot, and AirMet Sierra tells me that there's large areas of IFR conditions. It might be mountain obscuration, it might be due to fog, but in general, it just means a widespread area of IMC conditions. So obviously, if I'm a VFR pilot, I would want to avoid all AirMet Sierras for sure. That doesn't mean that I can't fly through maybe a corner of the AirMet Sierra if I've got VFR conditions elsewhere. That brings up a good point, and that, let's go ahead and talk about this. In the scenario, I might say, okay, well, let's say you're flying from here in Arkansas to someplace in Texas. And I say, okay, 50 miles south of here, you start flying over a layer of clouds. And the layer of clouds is below you about 3,000 feet. And they appear to be kind of blanketing the ground. Really pretty, by the way, if you've ever seen this. But you've got this layer of clouds that are just blanketing the area. And you see that it extends out another 40 miles, right about as far as you can see on the horizon. But just beyond that, you can see that it starts to open up. So are you legal to fly over this low IFR kind of cloud layer below you? Are you able to do that as a VFR pilot? The answer is yes. You don't have to see the ground to be legal to fly VFR, right? You can fly VFR in VMC conditions as a private pilot without an instrument rating and not be able to see the terrain below you. As long as you have the proper cloud clearance requirements, you're meeting the letter of the law. But here's what I want you to think about. If you're flying over a layer of clouds that has low visibility, and those cloud bases go all the way to, let's say, 200 feet or even the surface. Now, you're legal to fly above those. You're in clear air. You have a discernible horizon. You don't have to use your instruments, so you're trucking along in your plane, no problem. And you have an engine failure. You do your emergency procedures, you go to best glide, and you start gliding down. Now, if you're not within glide range of an area that's in VMC conditions down to the ground, you've got a big problem on your hands because you're going to glide into this cloud. And you may not have enough time when you glide through the bottom of that cloud to pick out a spot for you to do your forced landing on. So even me, with thousands of hours of instrument time, I'm very, very comfortable in instrument conditions. Have no problem flying. I'd have no problem gliding an airplane in instrument conditions. But you can't land in you can't do a forced landing in instrument conditions and expect a good outcome, right? It's basically, well, I'm just gonna fly best glide until I see something, and if it's a bunch of trees or a concrete wall, there's not much I can do about it. I can't see it because of my IMC. It's hard enough to do a landing in IMC conditions to a runway that has an instrument approach, much less in the middle of nowhere while you just had a forced landing event. So that is a exact scenario that I ask in a check ride is that something you would do? Have you thought about that as a private pilot? And more than likely in your training, you haven't been faced with that scenario because especially when we're training, we tend to be kind of fair weather flyers. So you may not have even thought about this scenario. So take that time to think through, okay, well, what would I do if I had to fly over an area that was covered by an Airmet Sierra? So that's a great answer to that, is saying, yeah, I'm not going to fly through an Airmet Sierra, even over the top of an Airmet Sierra. I'm going to fly around it. That way, if I have an engine failure, I can always find something on the ground to do a successful forced landing. All right, that's fog and mist. Frost. This is another big one. I'll usually start asking this in the wintertime. I try to be disciplined and ask it during the summer. It's impossible to ask all of these questions for every check ride, but I do like to throw in some questions about frost. If we show up in the morning and the plane is just covered in frost, what do? It's clear blue skies, just a thin layer of frost there on the plane. Can I take off? The answer is no. I can't take off with frost on the plane. I need to get the frost off of the plane, either mechanically by wiping it down, which could be a pretty big task. I could move it into a heated hangar. I could hangar it that night and prevent the frost, right? Or I could maybe maneuver, turn the airplane, taxi the airplane if I have to, or tug the airplane around where it's facing the sun, so when that sun comes up, it's quickly going to melt that ice off. And then the last one here is obstructions to visibility, smoke, haze, volcanic ash, etc. So this, if you're in the West, this might get asked a lot of, there's fields that when we have a big forest fire in the West that go in instrument meteorological conditions because of smoke, right? A big wildfire could cause an airfield to go into IMC conditions. It could lower your visibility, well below 3 miles. All right. And then last knowledge topic is flight deck instrument displays of digital weather and aeronautical information. So if your aircraft is equipped with the ADS-B then it's getting weather information from the FIS-B network, and that is providing you with basic METARs, TAFs, a sort of pixelated radar picture. I expect you to know how that stuff works. What I'm asking here is, okay, can you look it up? First of all, can you connect your iPad to it? Can you get weather information in flight from your iPad? Yeah, absolutely. If you have a Sentry that you fly with, or some sort of ADS-B receiver, absolutely, I can pull that information into my iPad and use it as a decision support system. The important thing I want you to realize is that information is now delayed, and I need to use it knowing that it could be delayed. Especially the radar picture. If you're using this to try to dodge a thunderstorm or some area of instrument conditions, for instance, you need to make those adjustments early and give it a wide berth, because that information could be delayed up to 15 minutes. It kind of depends on what you're looking at. I believe I have a link here that takes us to Aviation Weather Services. That's Chapter 13 in the PHAC. Chapter 13 in the PHAC talks about some of the weather services that we have, including our in-flight information that we have on our EFBs. Okay, now on to the risk management section of this item, or this section. Risk management 1, R1, making the go, no-go, and continued divert decisions, including, and this has 3 subcategories. A is circumstances that would make diversion prudent, personal weather minimums, and hazardous weather conditions, including known or forecast icing or turbulence aloft. So those are the 3 things that it brings up as risk management on deciding if you should make a go, no-go decision. Personal minimums, I have a link here. This is going to the Chapter 2 of the Risk Management Handbook. And that whole chapter is devoted to how to develop personal minimums for yourself. What I will expect as an examiner is that you have some sort of formalized personal minimums created for yourself. These need to be written down, and you need to be able to hand them to me and say, hey, these are the personal minimums that I'm holding myself to. Here's a really important thing that's practical to the actual check ride. If during your check ride, the weather becomes outside of your personal minimums and you decide to continue to fly, then that's grounds for disapproval, right? Because you're telling me on the ground portion, hey, these are my personal minimums. Well, remember, you're the pilot in command for the check ride. So if we step to the airplane and you decide to take off and violate your own personal minimums, then that is a failure. So create your own personal minimums and stick to them, including for the check ride, right? The right decision there is to say, hey, Seth, sorry, the winds are outside of my personal minimums, or the ceiling's below my personal minimums. I'm going to have to discontinue the test. And I'm going to say, hey, that's an excellent decision. Way to stick to your personal minimums. That's what they're for. So now that you know that, make sure you devise your personal minimums appropriately, right? Because we may have a longer discussion about your personal minimums if you say, well, I'm not going to fly unless I have 10,000 foot ceilings. Well, let's think about this for a second, because 10,000 foot ceilings, those are pretty high, right? 10,000 feet above the ground. We can't even cruise that high in 172 comfortably. We can definitely do all of our maneuvers safely from really 4,000 feet and below. We can do all of our maneuvers with no issues at all. So 10,000 foot ceilings, that's not real practical. So make sure your personal minimums are practical. Your CFI can help you to develop these. I've got resources in the ACE guide that help you develop your personal minimums. In fact, if you click on the personal minimums link here, it's off one page. Just scroll down a page. And I'll fix that in a future version. But it takes you to developing personal minimums from Appendix 4 out of a weather decision making AC. I didn't include the whole AC. I just included this page. This has all been integrated into the weather handbook, except they didn't bring this across. So what I really like about this is this is from the FAA. It has suggested personal minimums down here. So ceilings for day VFR, 3,000 foot ceilings, 5 miles visibility. Those are reasonable personal minimums. So you could just copy these straight across. You could make your own. It's really up to you as the pilot in command. Just make sure you do it prior to your check ride. Don't show up to your check ride without having developed some personal minimums with your CFI. Hazardous weather conditions, including known or forecast icing or turbulence aloft. We've already discussed this probably in the previous section going through the knowledge topic. It's just at what point is the turbulence going to cause you to divert or cancel? And then our forecast icing, knowing that icing chart and the freezing levels. Hey, if I've got forecast icing and I go and do my updated brief before I take off, and now the icing layers drop, or the icing levels drop to ground level, and we have visible moisture, that's a no-go decision right there. Okay, next we have R2. This is use and limitations of, another subcategory. We have 3 subcategories. R2A, installed onboard weather equipment. B, aviation weather reports and forecasts. C, in-flight weather resources. So use and limitations of each of those. So let's look at installed onboard weather equipment. We can find this in Chapter 13. It looks like this is the PHAC. We have electronic flight displays and multifunction display weather. So this is our next rad systems. This section of the PHAC covers all of that. If you've got weather, and I'll use the term under glass. And what that means is you have weather that's displayed to you on your main multifunction or PFD of your aircraft. So if you're flying an aircraft that has maybe aftermarket G5s, maybe an old 172 that has a couple of G5s, you may have weather in a Garmin 650. Might be a panel mount weather information. If you're flying, though, an older 6-pack and doesn't have any glass in it at all, but you have a Stratus that you put in the window to give you ADS-B in, now you've got weather information on your EFB. Essentially, those are coming from the same place. The big difference here, and I really don't expect you to know a huge difference between this, but just so you are aware, there's 2 different ways that we can receive weather in the plane on our iPad or in our displays. And that is one, the primary and most common one, is through ADS-B. So ADS-B, that's getting to us from ground stations. It's limited by line of sight, and it's also limited by the coverage of those ground stations, which isn't necessarily 100%. So there's portions of the country where you won't be able to get weather information. Those are probably getting fewer and farther between. But as we've gotten more and more into the ADS-B, system as it is, but there could be gaps in coverage there. The next way we could get weather information is through satellite. Now, satellite, obviously, that's not limited to line of sight. That's coming from above. It's also higher bandwidth, so we're typically we're going to get more information, and like a radar picture is going to be a higher resolution, not as pixelated as ADS-B weather. Satellite weather in the plane is generally limited to certain special receivers that you can buy that just sit on the dash, or the newer avionics, such as like a G1000 NXI, even the old G1000, you could have NexRad plugged in there. But those are going to be additional subscription fees, so it's going to be more expensive than ADS-B, because ADS-B is the service. ADS-B is free. You just need to have a way to receive it. So once you have that receiver, you can get ADS-B information at no cost. With NexRad information, the NexRad radar coming via satellite, that does involve a subscription fee. So you do have to pay for that service, but you get slightly better service. So that might be a question that you get asked during the check riders. What are the difference between NexRad and ADS-B? All right, now on to our skills. Remember, we have to demonstrate all of the skills in any task. So in this task, we have 3 skills. They are skill 1, use available aviation weather resources to obtain an adequate weather briefing. Skill 2, analyze the implications of at least 3 of the conditions listed in K3A through K3L using actual weather or weather conditions provided by the evaluator. And skill 3, correlate weather information to make a go, no-go decision. So the first one, man, this is an easy one to get done. Get a weather briefing the day of your check ride. You don't have to do it in front of the examiner. You can show up to your check ride. Please show up to your check ride having already completed a weather briefing. You can complete a weather briefing through 1-800-WeatherBrief.com, through calling 1-800-WeatherBrief, through ForeFlight, through Garmin Pilot. You can do a self-weather briefing. So let's talk about that. Let's say, well, I want to do a self-weather briefing. How do I do that? Well, let me show you an amazing checklist. There's here in the ACE guide, you just click on the weather briefing link, and it takes you directly to a page in Advisory Circular 91-92. This is a sample pre-flight checklist, and it is an excellent checklist for you to use if you're doing basically a self-conducted weather briefing. If you show up to the check ride and you've completed everything on this checklist here, and you know about the checklist, you have it either on your iPad, or you could print it off if you want. I'd suggest just having it on your iPad, and you can speak to each one of these items in the checklist. You have done, according to the FAA and myself, you've done a very good self-weather briefing. Now, whether you did that through an official service or you just piecemealed it together yourself using aviationweather.gov in this checklist, I don't care. You've met that skill in the ACS there. So skill 1, super easy. Skill 1, use that weather checklist or do a ForeFlight weather briefing. But do a weather briefing before you show up to your check ride. Don't show up during your check ride and you know your examiner is going to ask that. I'm going to ask that. Hey, did you get a weather briefing today? No, not yet. Well, come on. It's no surprise. It was right there in the ACS. So no, I'm not going to fail you if you don't have a weather briefing done, but I'm going to make you do a weather briefing. So you're either going to have to, generate one on ForeFlight. You're going to have to call. It's going to waste time. So just have this done. And of course, remember, this is all scenario-based questioning. So this is all in our, flight that we're doing to wherever I decided to, down to Pensacola or Houston, wherever we're going. I'm going to say, okay, well, you did the weather briefing maybe 5 hours ago, or even the day before. You did a weather briefing 12 hours prior to our flight. Now you want to do an updated weather briefing. How would that look? Well, again, you go back to your weather briefing checklist, and there's a standard weather briefing elements, and then there's abbreviated briefing elements. So just say, yeah, I would do the abbreviated elements that update my changes that I did in my briefing 12 hours ago. I'm going to update it 2 hours prior to the flight with this abbreviated. Perfect. Man, that's a great answer. All the answers are right here. All right, skill 2, analyze the implications of at least 3 of the conditions listed, K3, A through I. So this is the 3, you got to analyze 3 of the conditions that we talked about here. This is mentioned twice now in the ACS, mentioned there in the skills, and then we had a note 2 up at the top of the page that tells us this. So now we know for certain that our examiner is going to have to ask 3 of these questions. If they choose K2, they're also going to have to ask 3 of those questions, which I figure most examiners are going to wind up asking about METARs. So you're probably going to get at least 6 knowledge topic questions on this. I would say we're covering, in general, we're probably covering 8 on a check ride using scenario-based questioning. I can think of 8 just off the top of my head of, we're covering 3 of these. That's 3 down. I'm going to ask you about TAFs and METARs. So that's 5. We have to cover winds aloft for our cross-country navigation planning. That's 6. I'm always going to ask about airmets and sigmets. So that's 7. And the 8th one, what would the 8th one be? Oh, my prog chart question. Prog chart, that's number 8. So I'm always asking at least 8 questions. Don't get flustered at this. It's not a huge amount of information. I've tried to make the cross-referencing all of this information as easy as possible, and I'll be adding more links as we go on into the future here. But again, it's pretty straightforward to know how, to come up with some good answers to the scenario-based questions you could get around these topics. All right, lastly, skill 3, correlate weather information to make a go, no-go decision. Remember, that's already a risk management topic that it talked about, is making a go, no-go. So we're going to do a real-world go, no-go decision. If we're taking the check ride, more than likely it's a go decision, because the rules on a check ride should be that we don't start our check ride unless we think there's a reasonable chance that we can finish it. Right? That's the rules that we have to abide by as an examiner. So since we're doing the check ride right now, if you're getting asked these questions, you're doing a check ride, you probably are in a go scenario. Now, what I may want to do, and what I typically do, what other examiners may do, is they may change some of those observations that you had in the real world. So the day of the check ride, you're looking at the real weather. I may change some of those and say, well, let's say instead of broken at 6,000, the weather en route was broken at 2,500. How would that affect your decision-making process? And that may drive you to say, well, in that case, it would be a no-go for me. I wouldn't fly that route. And what I like to hear then is, how would you overcome that? So I would either wait for better conditions, or maybe it's better for me, okay, let me ask about this simulated weather you're giving me. Is there any better weather north or south or east or west of that I could fly to and avoid? And I may say, sure, to the north, it's completely clear. Okay, well, instead of canceling the flight altogether, I would change my flight to deviate around that area of low visibility or low ceilings, and I would go to the north. Now, since I know that between me and my destination there's low ceilings, I might also add in an extra fuel stop just in case the weather deteriorates, and that helps me mitigate the risk of the flight there. That's the type of answer that I really like to hear, because that shows me that you've got that higher level of pilot and command decision making, and the answer isn't just, nope, I'm going to cancel. Nope, I'm going to cancel I think that's the easy way out. And sure, typically, I'm not going to fail you. I'm not going to give you a disapproval because you cancel too many flights. I don't want to do that, right? But I also don't love to hear that answer all the time. I want to see you demonstrate some higher level decision making and kind of that analysis to say, yeah, I don't need to cancel this. I can do it safely. here's how I'm going to mitigate the risk. So instead of just saying no, give me a detailed answer of how you're going to do that. Now, you may get faced with a scenario where it's straight up, yeah, we just can't fly. There's no safe way to do this. We can't fly today. We're going to have to wait until tomorrow. Or we're going to have to wait until whatever, But that's how I would suggest answering that question. And that's some examples on how you could be asked this. Now, since I've mentioned it a couple of times, the new ACE guide has new scenarios, or new format of scenarios that are listed here. So the scenario that I give is you're flying to Palm Springs, taking your grandmother to a wedding there. That's the scenario we run through. If you take a check ride with me, you're going to get different scenarios. I probably have 5 or 6 different scenarios that you'll get. And they're all based on, hey, we have a reason to go from point A to point B. We have passengers with us. And in my scenarios, I typically say there's a weather system that's moved through recently. And the reason I do that is to cover the knowledge topics there of that frontal system movement, the prog chart, knowing how that affects the winds and air masses and all that. So hopefully other examiners are doing something similar. They give you some sort of scenario that you can plan for ahead of time, and it gives you a little bit of an idea of the kinds of questions that they might ask from this section. So that is task C of weather information. Next up, we have area of operation 1, task D, which is cross-country flight planning. This one is a little bit shorter, but we'll still devote a whole episode to that. Some updates on me. I'm working on the electrical system part 2. I think it's been like almost a year since I've did part 1 of the electrical system, but we've actually, a friend of mine, a mechanic, built a miniature aircraft electrical system for us. We're going to look at that and the schematics of the electrical system, get into that. What I might do as well is start releasing some CFI content, because, man, I get a lot of questions about CFI content. I think there's a lot of you guys that are out there preparing for a CFI exam. So I might start releasing some CFI episodes and kind of jump out of order here of just doing private pilot. If you would like to see content like that or anything else, feel free to contact me. Seth Lake at VSL.aero. You can also contact us on our Shopify store if you have a question about the ACE guide. A lot of people have been purchasing the ACE guide, and if you're watching this and you've purchased it, man, I really appreciate your support. That really has allowed me to dive into that guide and do a lot of updating on it. That's one of the reasons why I haven't been doing a lot of podcasting or videos lately, is I take a lot of time out of the week to work on this guide to make sure it's the most up-to-date and current and useful, and consistently I'm adding stuff to it. Love to hear the feedback from you guys as well. So I can tell I'm rambling, so it's time for me to tie things up here for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. Thanks for watching if you're joining us on YouTube. I hope to see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell somebody about this podcast and YouTube channel. If you want to continue the conversation, join us on our Discord channel. We've got a lot of great conversations that happen in Discord. I'm on that pretty much every day, and I'm doing live sessions on Discord, trying to do that once a week. So if you have some questions, jump over to our Discord channel. You can find links, I think, here on YouTube, but definitely on the site, vsl.aero. There's a Discord channel link there, and you can join us in between these episodes to keep the conversation going. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.